Hi everyone, we're so glad that you've joined us at the Center for Brain Health for our event. Let's get started with a brief video underscoring the importance of brain health for you and for society. After that, we'll introduce our speaker.
We work, we live, we innovate and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
So how do you boost brain power? Welcome to the Brain Health Project, an urgent call to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
This is an absolute crisis, as great as any we have ever faced. We have to equip the minds and brains of our citizens to cope with the accelerating, dizzying rate of change that they face in their lives.
Your brain health is not fixed. Scientific discoveries prove it can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point.
Our greatest value, the asset that will help us to change everything, every problem we're in, is all in our head.
To harness that treasure, we must measure and monitor progress while things are going well versus waiting for an injury or disease to strike.
Too many of us are outliving our brains, and that does not have to be the case.
The information age is bombarding us with more content than our human brains can handle. How do you keep from getting lost in this? And focus on deep thinking. For starters, stop multitasking.
Science shows us that multitasking is bad for your brain. It reduces fluid intelligence, causes brain atrophy, and increases chronic stress.
The global pandemic is creating more stress than ever, stress that leads to depression and anxiety and beyond. Unlocking our potential to navigate these hurdles starts with learning the right strategies, even in school.
So when teachers have these strategies, they're empowered to support our learners, and then the learners are now able to take ownership of their learning.
Training kids how to think is doubling academic achievement among middle schoolers.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Our world-renowned scientists know you can increase your brain health, not lose it. It's time for a new category of health, brain health. You are a game changer. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Hello, and welcome everybody to the Frontiers of Brain Health, where we take a deep dive into the most exciting new developments in brain research. I'm Dan Krauzik. I am a professor in behavioral and brain science at UT Dallas and also the deputy director here at the Center for Brain Health. We'll have a few minutes at the end of the talk today for some questions. So I encourage you to use the Q&A function in Zoom if you have a question, and you can ask that really anytime during the talk. And we'll try to get as many of those answered as we can at the conclusion of the presentation. We are a cognitive neuroscience research center at the University of Texas at Dallas, and we've dedicated the past 3 decades to exploring neuroplasticity, the brain's amazing lifelong potential to get stronger and work better. If you stay to the end, we'll also talk about our groundbreaking research study, the Brain Health Project. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Asheley Landrum. Asheley is at Texas Tech in Lubbock, and she is currently in the College of Media and Communication there. But she's a very interesting scholar with a diverse background, a critical part of which happened here in Dallas. So I've known Asheley for a number of years, going back to when she was a PhD student here with Candace Mills in the Department of Psychology at UT Dallas. And at the time, she was working on some fascinating research that had a lot to say about our reasoning capacity. And then she went on in her career to a postdoctoral fellowship, which was at the University of Louisville, initially in psychological science, brain science there. She then moved to the Annenberg Communication Center at the University of Pennsylvania, which is a bit of a different perspective because it's a school of communication. So over the years, in moving toward being an assistant professor there, and she's actually wanted me to mention she's going to be an associate professor soon there, she focuses on strategic scientific communication, which is a really critical area. It barely needs to be mentioned how important that is at the current time. And she's a very integrative scholar, combining a psychological perspective with real world information. And all of this couldn't be more timely. Her works appeared in numerous journals, including Nature, Climate Change, Trends in Cognitive Science, Trends in Biotechnology, Developmental Science, Cognition, and Advances in Political Psychology. So you really get a sense that she's publishing across a diverse set of areas within the field. It's not news to anyone that pockets of the general population reject conclusions that are widely accepted by the scientific community. That's an enormous problem that we have to cope with. And she notes that information sources, including expert opinions and other communicators, are not always truthful. They depend upon the limitations of that person's knowledge. The quality of information can vary, and there can even be misinformation. And all of that leads to great confusion. We have a major problem in the United States right now with people understanding the message that scientists want to communicate. And so that's really the fascinating topic of today. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome our speaker, Asheley Landrum.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly share my screen and then start my presentation here. All right. So as Dr. Krozik said, my name is Asheley Landrum, and I got my PhD from the University of Texas at Dallas under Candace Mills. And yeah, definitely the jump from my postdoctoral work at University of Louisville to working at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania seems like a big jump, but really I'm still studying the same questions, which is, how we come to trust experts and expertise and how we reason about scientific information. And so I started off looking at that with children, and then realized that adults are sort of just as terrible at that. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about that, speaking specifically about knowledge and identity and how these two important factors interact to influence whether or not, or to what extent, we accept science. So, as Dr. Krozik mentioned, really nobody argues at this point that the scientific community and members of the public tend to disagree on some issues related to science. So now this data is a little bit outdated, number one, because it's from 2015, but number two, Pew Research Center, the way that they found scientists to interview was to find those that were members of AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, members from AAAS are not all scientists. Some are science teachers. Some are people who are just interested in science. But it still kind of generally shows us a point, and that's that we see these large gaps between the number or the proportion of people who are science adjacent accept something and those who are members of the public. So one obviously is the 37-point gap, at least in 2015, when it came to belief in anthropogenic global climate change. Another is a 33% gap between members of the public, which are in blue, and the scientific community in believing in human evolution or accepting that that is true. An 18-point gap, although this has probably increased drastically over the past year, in the acceptance or saying that childhood vaccination should be required. And the largest one at this time was the 51-point gap between the public and people who are science adjacent in believing that it's safe to eat genetically modified foods. So why do publics, and we say publics plural, because there is no sort of one homogeneous public. We have a lot of different groups of people who have different sorts of backgrounds, different types of knowledge, different levels of expertise. And so why do these different publics disagree with scientists? Well, there's sort of three factors that contribute to this. The first one that we've looked at is a problem of knowledge. Another is the problem of identity. And the third one is the problem of trust. And as Dr. Krozek alluded to, a lot of my research early on in my PhD looked at trust, and I am still looking at that. But today I'm going to talk mostly about these first two, and that's the problem of knowledge and the problem of identity. But again, all three of them are very interrelated. So one of the most intuitive explanations for why people don't accept science is that don't know about science. And Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist and a science communicator here actually at Texas Tech, but who's world renowned, has this great video explaining this on her Global Weirding channel on YouTube. This is part of that animation. And it's, well, if they just knew the facts, they would change their mind, right? Well, this intuitive theory of science denial is referred to as the knowledge deficit hypothesis, and is held by a variety of scientists, educators, and figures in public policy. In fact, this past summer and in the past really couple of years, many of you have heard doctors and public health officials lamenting that people won't act appropriately to mitigate the risk of COVID-19 because they just don't understand the science behind it. Concepts that are related to the knowledge deficit hypothesis, and are sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, are the information deficit model and the public deficit model. And these models basically, sort of at their core, state that public uncertainty or skepticism towards certain scientific issues are the direct result of a lack of knowledge about those issues. Therefore, if we want to address this problem, it just involves, providing adequate education and or teaching scientists how to communicate more clearly without jargon. So what would that look like? Well, and in this case, so this is just conceptual. If we have increasing knowledge on this x-axis here, right, so low knowledge down here at the bottom and high knowledge down at the top, whether it's about science in general or a specific science issue, we'd expect that we would see an increase. So as knowledge increases, so does acceptance. Of course, people might not automatically reject something just because they have low knowledge about it. So another version of this would be a 50-50 acceptance. So you can flip a coin whether they'd say it's, whether they say that that scientific theory is true or false in their perspective. And then you would expect that it would increase with knowledge. So again, this seems intuitively correct. So why do communication scholars refer to this knowledge deficit hypothesis as being debunked? And it's not just communication scholars. So the National Academy of Sciences did hold a consensus panel on scientific literacy. And one of their core results from this consensus panel in this large review is that studies using measures of science knowledge observe a small positive relationship between science literacy and attitudes toward and support for science in general. However, the relationship is small, and available research does not support the claim that increasing science literacy will lead to appreciably greater support for science in general. So again, this is the science of science literacy and scientific acceptance. And the National Academy of Sciences has pointed out that this is sort of where the literature stands. And so I'm going to start with my takeaways a bit early in the presentation, so I have the opportunity to repeat them, but also because they will structure my talk. But first is that knowledge is relevant to science acceptance, but it's not the whole story. There's a difference between measuring people's existing knowledge and interventions that are meant to increase knowledge, to increase support. And finally, interventions to increase knowledge may only work on certain subgroups, depending on their prior background, beliefs, values, etc. So let's start with knowledge is relevant, but not the whole story. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples with data that we've collected from a variety of different studies. The first being climate change. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 within the context of vaccination and masking, evolution, and then some of my work that's gotten a little bit more attention, which is on people who believe the earth is flat. They really do. So what about for climate change? So again, this would have been the hypothesis, or something around the 50-50, that as science knowledge increases, so does the probability of acceptance. And now for this specific study, we used a measure of science knowledge or science literacy that's referred to as the OSI, or ordinary science intelligence. And this measure combines across a variety of different measures that have been used by other scholars. So part of this measure includes the scientific facts that the national academies have used as science indicators over the past several years. It includes some items from need for cognition. It also includes some items from numeracy, so people's ability to understand things like probability, or even like how to set up a good experiment. So the reason why I like this measure is because it does sort of cut across all of the different ways that scientific literacy have been measured. But I will say that even if we replace science knowledge here with education, so like the number of years of education that people have had, or any other, we tend to find the same results because they are very highly correlated. So for climate change, what do we find? So across the public, we do see, and look, you can see here that it's kind of the bottom line here is closer to 5.0. And just in case, those of you who are interested, yes, P is less than 0.05. So when researchers run regression analyses and see that there's a relationship between science knowledge and acceptance, they get excited, right? They say, look, all we have to do is increase knowledge. But the thing is that this is not the whole story. It fails to take into consideration the most important predictor of climate change beliefs, at least in the US, but also in many other parts of the world. And so here in the US, the strongest predictor of climate change views is political ideology. So if I take the same data and I divide participants out by whether they voted previously for the Democrat or for the Republican in the last election, you see that this figure changes drastically. In fact, Republicans in this data sample, and this was from, I think, 2017, the more science knowledge they had, the more likely they were to reject that climate change is human caused in this case. So, this is important, and this is a finding that we've shown over and over again. In some cases, it's even less, and like this one is. In other cases, it just goes straight across down there at the bottom. But the hypothesis here is that people with more knowledge who are ideologically predisposed to reject something based on what the sort of the talking points of those groups or the beliefs of that group, like climate change, use their scientific knowledge to be better at motivating their own perspectives. And this kind of goes back to some work that John Haidt talks about. I don't know if any of you have read his book about the rider and the elephant, and the idea that the elephant or your sort of like gut intuition goes whichever way it wants to, and then the rider is sort of the rational side that then justifies that action, but it's actually after the fact. So it feels like it's ahead of time, but it's a post hoc justification of your existing views. So those with more knowledge may be better at using their ideology to reason about why they believe that in the first place and motivate their own perspectives. So that's for climate change. But what about for COVID-19? Again, talking about like vaccine intentions and views on masking. So here's some of that data. In this case, we used a measure of germ knowledge, which was a collection of items there. And you can see we broke it out by whether people tend to vote for the Democrat, Republican, or other. And for the Republican group, it's pretty flat across. So knowledge doesn't contribute significantly to people's agreement that they have gotten or intend to get a COVID-19 vaccine. However, with Democrats who aren't at this point in this current climate ideologically predisposed to reject the COVID-19 vaccine, you see an increase in their intention to get vaccinated as germ knowledge increases. We can look at the same thing. So this is masking. And this is masking by science knowledge. So this is using that ordinary science intelligence measure that I talked about before. And again, this is to what extent they agree with the statement that wearing masks is effective for helping prevent the transmission of COVID-19 to others. As science knowledge increases, Republicans' agreement with this is basically flat to somewhat decreasing, whereas for Democrats, it increases with science knowledge. But that, one thing that's important to note is even at the low end here, there's still relatively high agreement with this item. Now I can change this from ordinary science intelligence and look back at germ knowledge, and we see basically the same thing. The relationships are very similar with just a slight shift. But again, the group that's not ideologically predisposed to reject it, you see that increase with increasing knowledge, but the other groups, you don't see that. So what about with human evolution? So with human evolution is interesting because the relationship is a lot stronger. So in this case, we're looking at evolution knowledge, but it's the same if we look at ordinary science intelligence, because we've measured both. As evolution knowledge increases, you have a pretty stark increase in the probability of accepting that humans evolved. And the question says, I think that humans evolved from other species of mammal. And so you do see that strong increase. But again, if we divide this out, and in this case, the strongest predictor of beliefs about human evolution are people's religiosity. And in this case, we measure religiosity with a combination of how frequently they pray and how important their religion is to their everyday life. People used to use a measure of how many days a week one attends church, but that hasn't sort of come out to actually show how religious people are. It tends to show what their religion is. So with frequency of prayer and religious importance, we break that out into three groups with our least religious, our most religious, and those who are kind of in the middle. And you can see that among the most religious, they basically reject evolution regardless of how much knowledge about evolution they have. Whereas the least religious, you have that strong increase. So knowledge contributes to acceptance among those who are not ideologically predisposed to reject it. So again, so knowledge equal greater acceptance. Well, for those who are very religious, more knowledge does not appear to influence their views. But, and in some cases, for those who are politically conservative, more knowledge may mean more denial when it comes to issues about climate change or COVID-19. But again, knowledge does help for some. For those who are not ideologically predisposed to reject scientific information because of the environment that they live in, you will still see an increase in acceptance with an increase in knowledge, whether you're looking at ordinary science intelligence or domain-specific knowledge. But again, some authors will publish their statistically significant findings and lament that knowledge predicts acceptance and that all other scholars have it wrong. But what's being argued here when they say that the knowledge deficit hypothesis has been debunked is not that knowledge doesn't have a role to play, but it's not the whole picture. You have to take identity variables into consideration when predicting people's views towards science, especially when the topic is known to be publicly, if not scientifically, controversial. You have to look for those interaction effects. So again, acceptance of science increases with knowledge only when people are not motivated to reach different conclusions. But even then, they may not be motivated to question science in the first place. And so this is, we're going to go and talk about the flat earth group here. So does more knowledge equal, in this case, lower acceptance, right? So what about when it comes to believing that the earth is flat? And in this case, there's such a low proportion of people sort of in public in general that actually believe the earth is flat right now, that what we used instead as our outcome variable for this study was finding the flat earth videos. So the videos on YouTube that argue that the earth is flat and provide their justifications for why they believe this, whether they find those compelling. And so again, our hypothesis here would be that how compelling they find those videos, or in this case, we used a measure of argument strength. So that viewing that these videos are making good arguments would decrease with ordinary science intelligence, right? So science knowledge measured by this method I talked about previously. And we do see this across the public, right? So we see that argument strength. And in this case, the measure was from 0 to 100. So the fact that it was low is very helpful to start. So as ordinary science intelligence increases, the opposite happens for how strong they find the arguments made in these videos about the flat earth. But again, like climate change and evolution and COVID-19, we need to take into consideration the strongest ideological predictor of those beliefs. Now, for flat Earth, the strongest ideological predictor is conspiracy mentality. And we used a measure of conspiracy mentality by Bruder and his colleagues, and we divided people into two groups. So this is just taking the top 25% of people who scored. So they score in the top 25% of conspiracy mentality, and the bottom. So people score the lowest 25% of conspiracy mentality. And so I've centered and scaled the dependent variable, and as well as graphed it. So you're looking at it on the centered and scored axes. Now you'll see that for people who don't have any ideological reason to believe the Earth is flat, so those who are very low in conspiracy mentality, they don't accept conspiracies, knowledge doesn't really affect their acceptance of this at all. It's a pretty flat line. But for those who are higher in conspiracy mentality, knowledge does affect. In fact, it seems to have a protective effect. So the more knowledge that they have about science, and even if they're high in conspiracy mentality, the less likely they are to believe that the flat Earth videos were making strong arguments. So this is somewhat promising for the knowledge deficit. And in some ways, it's showing kind of a different interaction effect. And that's, again, that the people who are not affected by knowledge are those who didn't have any reason to question it in the first place. But again, this could be driven by the fact that very, very few people currently, and I hope it stays this way, believe that the Earth is flat. So in this case, well, did more knowledge equal lower acceptance? Well, for those who aren't conspiracy theorists, there was no need to even question the shape of the Earth. So, and I know a prism isn't the perfect metaphor here, but I like to think of it as, identity through a filter through which information is processed. So everybody can be looking at the same bit of information, but through the lens of their own views and values, they will interpret it differently. There's perception metaphors to this as well. I remember, and I think I might have just left UTD when the dress controversy came out. There was that picture of a dress, and half the people who looked at it thought it was blue and black, and the other half thought it was white and gold. And it just depended on sort of how you perceived those contextual factors. Was it, how was the light sort of in the room? How were you interpreting that? Did you interpret that it was sort of a bleeding photo or not? So again, everybody can be looking at the same set of facts. So, and this is why we say that, facts don't matter. It's not that facts don't matter as a whole. It's that you can give people the same factual information, and to what extent they trust those facts or believe that that there's an issue with those, or that it's only part of the picture, has a lot to do with their pre-existing views and values. So here's another image for it too, right? So people's beliefs, they're viewing truth through their own lens, and through that lens, and in this case, this is still very much rational thinking. You're comparing data that you see in the world to what you have in your existing data bank. Does it make sense? Does it not? And then accepting or rejecting or modifying those beliefs as you see fit. But so more than just an interaction between identity, your knowledge can lead to motivated explanations for phenomena that fall somewhere between accept and reject. So in the previous slides, when we were talking about human evolution, for example, I talked about the probability of accepting that human evolution is true. But if we just ask it this way, in this binary way, we might be missing some people's levels of acceptance that are slightly different. So let's look at human evolution. So if we ask people, humans evolved from earlier species of animal, true or false? You might find that only 29% of people think that humans evolved. Only 29% of people said this is true. But is that true? Is it really such a small group of people who believe that? So we refer to this as the naturalists group. So they believe that humans developed entirely through natural processes. But if we give people other options that allow for their ideology to help them make sense of scientific information, we find that we see an increase in a general acceptance of issues like evolution. So if we give people the creationist option, which is just absolute rejection of evolution. So we say humans were created by God in more or less their current form. You get about 36% who say this. But if you say humans developed through natural processes, which were guided by God the whole time, or this is the theist option, we get about 18% who say that. And then we have a deist option. So humans developed through natural processes, which were set up by God, but then continued on their own. So in this case, you're giving people like 3 options to sort of accept human evolution, 2 of which allow them to make sense of evolution in the context of their religion. And what you end up is you see that in the first way that you look at it, only 29% seem to accept evolution. But if you look at it where you give people the option to integrate their ideology with the science, we can see that up to 64%, for example, might accept some version of evolution. So it's not always simple as reject. The other thing that I want to point out too is that there's a difference between measuring people's existing knowledge and the interventions that are meant to increase their knowledge, increase their acceptance. So does knowledge increase acceptance, or does acceptance increase knowledge? And we call this the measurement problem. So for example, one of the questions on the Ordinary Science Intelligence Questionnaire that I told you that we use for science literacy asks whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun. Now, when I was surveying flat earthers, I had to ask myself, well, is it really fair to ask this question to measure science literacy when I know it's part of their mental model for the flat earth system that the sun goes around the earth? And they know that science says that the earth goes around the sun, but they reject it as part of their ideology. So sometimes we need to ask what scientists say versus asking people if something is true or false. So do scientists say that humans evolved versus did humans evolve? Because in some cases, you end up asking questions that are really measuring people's ideology and not measuring whether they know that science believes that to be true. So can someone who answers consistent with their identity look like they have all the right answers, but not really know the right answer? That is also true. And in fact, Dan Kahan and I were working on a measure looking at views about climate change. And we found that for people who believe that climate change is true, they were more likely to say, for example, that carbon is very bad for plants and animals. Because they know that carbon is bad for climate change. So, and that's not necessarily true. So, especially when scientists have, some biases themselves about, what should constitute knowledge that is used in these situations, we have to stop and ask ourselves, are we testing whether people who we're testing whether people who reject it are rejecting it based on the beliefs that are part of their ideology. But are there other ways too that we can ask to see if the people who accept it truly understand what they're talking about, or if they're just accepting it because that's what's consistent with their ideology? And so finally, I wanted to mention, again, the interventions to increase knowledge may only work on some subgroups. And, one of the ones that we talk about a lot, for example, is messaging about the scientific consensus for climate change and how it's possible that what people are doing when they do that is they're really increasing people who already accept that climate change is real. They're increasing their view of what scientific consensus means or how strong the consensus is, but they're not necessarily increasing the view or increasing acceptance among those who don't. And since 77% of people believe that climate change is real and human caused, which is a nice large percentage, it might look like you're actually moving people, but you need to be thinking about which target audiences are you actually moving. And now we saw, for example, we saw movement when we used this figure, and now this is just sort of a pilot study here. We used this figure that we edited slightly. It was from one of the first papers to come out in Science about masking and COVID-19, where we had an explanation. We called it a how possibly explanation for how masks work. And we asked people, how much do they agree or disagree that wearing masks helps prevent the transmission of COVID-19 after having watched this? After having seen this versus not having seen this image here. And we found that for Democrats, they were basically already at ceiling anyway. They agree very strongly that masks help prevent. But for our Republicans in the sample, again, this was based on whom they voted for in the previous election, we found that for those who were not exposed to the message, that they had a much lower agreement. It was still, sort of in the middle here, about 55. Whereas Republicans who had seen the image and were allowed to like make sense of it on their own, for them, the acceptance increased. So among this group, acceptance was much higher. So it is possible that you can get interventions to work on subgroups. And now, again, if we looked at this data overall, it would look like nobody had moved. But when you look among specific subgroups, you can find out which groups are the ones, or which publics are the ones that are reacting to the message that you're designing. And when trying to message, you have to pick the message that's going to resonate with the group that you're trying to shift their attitudes in. So again, my takeaway refrain: knowledge is relevant, but it's not the whole story. There's a difference between measuring people's existing knowledge and the interventions that are meant to increase their knowledge. And we also have to think of that measurement problem. Are we really measuring knowledge, or are we measuring their ideology? And then interventions meant to increase knowledge may only work on some subgroups. So we need to be looking at those interactions between ideology or age to find out who is really moving on these issues. Because it doesn't matter if we take a group of people that already accept something and make them accept it more, especially when that minority can be loud and very effective in holding their own views. So we can't only address knowledge gaps. We have to think about the multiple causes of rejection and their interactions. Thank you so much. And then I do have a list of some of the papers that I had referred to in this presentation, if you're interested, and others that are still under review. Thank you.
All right. Very provocative, interesting work, Ashley. Let's go ahead and start the questions session at this point. And there's certainly a lot to talk about here. I guess I'll get the ball rolling by, I thought that Weisberg study that's cited there was quite interesting on evolutionary rejection, that it depends on how you group people. It was one of the sort of leading indicators there. And it seems as if there are other ways that, I mean, it's part of your work. It's like how many measures are really relevant to the framing or what who the intervention's aimed at. And so one of the questions that comes up, we work a lot with things like cognitive reflection ability, or tolerance to ambiguity, or something like need for cognitive closure. And those are sort of like individual difference measures that we all have. We sort of have this preference for clean cut information versus knowledge is murky. And the reason I bring that up is just that science inherently has this sort of mixed shades of gray, complicated way about it, because we're always trying to seek, falsifying our hypothesis that is the goal. Whereas rejecting science really turns upon incredibly clear-cut, black and white style of information presentation. So I wonder if you've thought about some of those other individual difference measures that might add subtypes within your work.
Yeah, definitely. And, we have looked at some in, so the other Weisberg paper so this is in collaboration with Dina and Michael Weisberg. So we had the one that I talked about from 2018. We did another one that was just published in 2021, where we looked at their epistemology and finds that, epistemology in some ways works much like knowledge, with people who have those sort of higher levels of, like more progressed, sort of reflective, epistemologies react like those who have higher knowledge. It is complicated. So we tend to, again, because of the number of participants that we could afford with any given survey, we try not to cut them up too much. But yes, I think that those measures do matter. And now, like I said, the OSI does have sort of as a component of it some of the like need for cognition and cognitive reflection task measures. The interesting thing about cognitive reflection, specifically the CRT, those 3 questions that they ask, is that it provides a lot of information on people who score over the mean, and people who score below the mean, you sort of have no information on. So if people get 0 right, they're at the 50th percentile, and you really can't parse them apart and say, well, are there differences between people at these lower levels? But for people who get, 1, 2, or 3 questions right, you're getting this nice sort of divide in different groups of people. So, and that's part of why we included that as the as part of our of ordinary science intelligence measure, because we can get breaking that out with more data helps us figure out what's going on the bottom half of that scale there. So yes, those measures are definitely related, and in some cases, unfortunately, negatively correlated with acceptance, again, when it comes to ideology. So we often look at ideology just because of that really strong relationship, because certain issues, and again, it's not that all issues of science become politically or religiously entangled. There's very specific ones that have a lot to do with the way that the issue was rolled out, or the social context that was going on when the issue appeared. I have a chapter with Dan Kahan on the HPV vaccine, where we compare it to the hepatitis C vaccine. In a lot of ways, they're very, very similar. But people freaked out about the HPV vaccine, and that had a lot more to do with how that vaccination was rolled out than it did what the vaccination did or who it was for. And so, our goal is to try to stop these things from becoming politically entangled in the first place. But of course, that's not up to us. It just takes sort of one talking head to make something politically entangled.
Right. Really complex problem. On that note, one of the questions that came up in the Q&A related to the role of one's verbal community. So friends, loved ones, religious groups, other communities, and what influence would you say that kind of community has in relation to I suppose it's not just simply science communicators and journalists communicating. There's this sort of social version as well. Can you comment?
Right. Well, so I have anecdotal data on this, or some interview data, but I don't have a lot in terms of big numbers. So we would hypothesize, based on what we've sort of heard from some of our research participants, that prior to the internet, your sort of social group had a lot more influence on what your beliefs were. And you would often talk to your friends or family members about things that you were thinking, or gut check some of your reactions to something. But because of social media and the ability to have, groups of people who have shared experiences, who may not live in the same area, we actually see, for example, among the flat Earth community, people cutting themselves off from their family members and their friends when they have diverging views from them. Some of the flat earthers described their experience as sort of like a coming out. They actually used that kind of language, like coming out to their families. And when they came out as flat earthers to their families, they were rejected. And their families tried talking to them about this, but they realized that they just disagreed. They had completely different worldviews, where one's evidence would be rejected by the flat earther, and vice versa. So they just stopped talking. Many of them were cut off from their friends, family, spouses, even their churches. And have then sort of formed those new relationships with people that they met through the flat Earth YouTubing world, and Reddit communities. So, I think it's important to try to maintain those social connections, especially because we see with issues like climate change that your social group, your friends and your family have more influence on you than any sort of like opinion leader at like a federal or national level. But sometimes maintaining those relationships is very difficult, especially when reason isn't going to help, because you don't agree on those sort of baseline assumptions to help you then build your argument off of. For example, you can trust what you see, or you can trust the government.
Right. There's definitely a complicated social picture there, where professing to reject a view is potentially going to cause a problem within your community, whomever that might be. And I would gather it's a lot more complicated now with how interconnected the world is. Another question, noting this is fascinating and timely research, it absolutely is. What do you see your role as a scholar and scientist in terms of advising on public policy, or possibly politicians or even educators? In other words, how do you get, what's your strategy to help get this messaging to the people that are responsible for, having a megaphone and commenting on public policy?
Right. And, so I'm still relatively early in my career, so I'm not sure how much I'm, being listened to by those who have power, but I have been working pretty closely with public media organizations to talk about how they talk about these issues. So I had 2 grants with KQED Public Media, which is a PBS affiliate in San Francisco. And I was working with them on, because they're a huge content producer. And many of the PBS affiliates aren't producing their own content, but are sharing content that is produced by sort of a couple different hubs. So that's one of the reasons why I was working with them. And, we talked about how to do a lot of this. We were doing research on that. And so that's sort of where I've fit my nation, is sort of helping the media shape their information. But I do have more senior collaborators who are working on committees with public politicians at the federal level. One, a faculty member from Rutgers, who was an advisor of mine while I was at Penn, his name is William Hallman. He has served on committees and panels trying to work with politicians on how to talk about things like COVID-19 and vaccination. So, one can hope that, through some of those connections and others that, I can help, but I have been working on research projects that do go kind of through that filter to talk to public officials about how to talk about this. But again, they have to be open to listening. And, when I was at the Public Policy Center, a lot of that goes on. So, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, and, they'll hold her and her colleagues and others with that type of expertise will hold, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a getaway where they talk about these issues. So for example, talks about the Election Commission and what suggestions they might give to organizations that are supporting or working on the presidential debates, and suggesting things like, don't have live audiences in the room, because then your presenters are playing to the audience and they're not actually talking to each other. And, maybe have live fact checking to, ensure that audiences, as they're hearing misinformation, because it inevitably comes from both participants in a debate, that it can be checked immediately. And, but they will accept what they want to accept and reject what they want to reject. So you can only do so much, but we try. And anybody who's watched the Don't Look Up movie can probably get a feel for that.
Right. Don't Look Up is incredibly alarming, and not because it's about a meteorite hitting Earth, but the humans' perceptions. If you have not seen that, it's a little depressing. Anyway, I think that's an excellent answer. It's going to be a grand challenge, frankly, for all of us involved in science to get the word out to other individuals who influence public perceptions. I guess one thing that occurred to me as you were describing that approach is, as scholars, I think we need to undergo that process of getting media coverage for our work, because when I've had that happen, it's kind of a negotiation of how much definitive, clear advice can you give that's still responsible, and it sort of forces you as a scientist to really think about how the public is going to perceive what you're saying, so you don't seem like you're hemming and hawing, as we often appear to as scholars. Another question related to outgroups and in-groups within these communities, specifically with ideologies and their interaction with acceptance of science. So there's a construct called affective polarization, other measures like outgroup intolerance. And I wonder, the question is, have you looked at any of those sorts of measures that I guess are other ways to group people or subgroup people that would probably be relevant to how they perceive science messaging?
Yeah, definitely. I have not looked at those specifically. I started to look at sort of like acceptance of authoritarianism and populism, or like populist type views on acceptance of science, which populist at least the scale that's used to measure populist views correlates very strongly with conspiratorial views. And you could understand why. I mean, if the basis of populism is sort of a lifting of the people and a rejection of authority, you might see that that sort of goes hand in hand with being suspicious of authorities and institutions, which is the base of conspiratorial beliefs. So I have not done those specifically, but there was a paper that came out recently, I think in Nature Human Behavior, that looked at sort of like tolerance for outgroups among people's views and how that kind of relates to things like conspiracy belief, and have found that the sort of tolerance for outgroups decreases as you get farther out to both ends of a left-right political ideology scale. So like the more extreme you are in your political views, the less tolerant you are of diverging beliefs. And yeah, I mean, that definitely will take place. And again, one of the things that could be frustrating about this area of research is that the scales or the measures that tend to predict science denial have been pretty diverse. So, it kind of depends on how that issue is entangled in identity, if it's entangled in politics or religion, or, for a while there, genetically modified organisms and their sort of your concern about how risky it was to consume them was not related to political ideology or, other types of worldviews like that, but it had a very weak link with religiosity. Again, not any specific religion, but just being somebody who has a high amount of faith or believing that things happen for a reason, and being female, and being a parent. And so, there's an interaction of, again, and so that's why I think it's important when thinking about some of these issues, you have to sort of think ahead of time, like, to which groups might we run up against, and based on how we're talking about this, or who might be most concerned. So yeah, it's interesting, complex, and not always 100% predictive for every single issue. I also want, I talked about several issues here that tend to make it look like political conservatives are more likely to reject science than political liberals. But in some cases, it's driven sort of by two things. One is that these are kind of the big issues that we talk about a lot, and they happen to be on that side of the issue. The other is that the sort of views and opinions within conservative groups tend to be a bit more homogenous than in progressive groups. You have a lot of division within progressive groups. And so you'll have sort of infighting and different views there. So you do see a bit more frustration there. Now, we have done studies. There's one that I have on this page. It's this culturally antagonistic memes and the Zika virus, where we sort of combined talking about the Zika virus in what was framed as a news article with either climate change or immigration. And when we said that, that Zika is going to get worse due to climate change because areas of the United States that will warm to the point where it will be habitable for the Aedes aegypti mosquito that transmits it. Thus, you should be worried about climate change if you're worried about Zika. In that condition, we drove conservatives away, and conservatives said they weren't worried about Zika and they didn't accept that it caused microcephaly. In the other condition, we paired it with immigration, and we said, as immigration increases and we have people moving from areas of the world where the Aedes aegypti mosquito is very common to this area, we're going to see an increase in cases of Zika. Then we had conservatives saying that, yes, Zika is important and I believe it caused microcephaly. And you had liberals that said that Zika wasn't an important issue and rejected that and in this case, we didn't use the straight left-right paradigm. We used a sort of a two measure of communitarian, individualist, hierarchist, sort of two-dimension scale here, and then have these four quadrants. But again, it's not that, and I think a lot of people, particularly those of more of a progressive frame of mind, would love to say, oh yeah, progressives, we reason about science in this great way, but those conservatives don't. But realistically, it's a problem on two sides. It just so happens that the big issues that we talk about regularly are those that are ideologically entangled in such a way that conservatives would be more likely to reject them.
Yes, it seems like framing effects are so prevalent. That's a great example. Just sort of swapping the political window dressing can change one's endorsement of something that really has nothing to do with politics objectively. Not that any of us are fully objective. And I'm reminded of some of the work of Frank Kyle and Steve Sloman on this idea that causal reasoning is so critical, and that it's really getting someone to understand what are the cause and effect relationships at play with something like a virus, irrespective of politics. But I guess even there, people have their pre-existing biases can influence how they see that. A relevant question, getting into social media, which is of course a major moving piece in all of this. Social media has allowed us to market politics and political parties in a way that are both good and bad for people as a whole. But the thought here is that early childhood education, maybe at the elementary school level, could help to teach a separation of conspiracy theories as well as critical thinking skills, no doubt there. And are there studies that you're aware of that determine some kind of age range at which the basis for a lot of these beliefs are formed? Kind of a developmental question.
Well, so my work with Candace, we showed that kids in a lot of ways are perfectly capable of recognizing who's giving you accurate versus inaccurate information. But a study that she had done with a grad student who was one of Candace's students at the same time as me, Fedwa Elashi, found that even in a minimal group paradigm, meaning a group that children were not a part of when they came into the lab, but you told them, okay, you're going to be assigned to the red group. And now, children in the red group wear this vest, and then they color this triangle red, and you have them do that. While they recognize, so let me set this back up a little bit more. So after you assign kids to these groups, then they see two people, and they see an object. And first it'll be an object that they know, like a pen. And the person in their group give them the wrong name, and the person in the other group gives the right name. So the person in the wrong group might say, that's a doll. And the person in the opposite group says, that's a pen. And then you ask the student which one was correct. At 4 or 5 years old, kids know who is correct. But then at the end, when you ask them to make a judgment about who was better at answering the questions, they'll say their in-group member was, even though they got all the questions wrong. And this is a minimal group paradigm. So this is not a group that they belong to with any sort of, deep fervor. And so, you see that groupishness at such a young age that it's not surprising that we would see it again later as they get older. And there's some evidence that having highly expert knowledge can help prevent people from thinking ideologically within that very narrow expert context, but it doesn't protect them from thinking ideologically outside of that expert context. And, well, what does that mean? My dissertation research looked at, our understanding of expertise and narrow versus wide. And, you might have broad expertise, but if it's not what you're specializing in, you're probably just as likely to make the same mistakes as any member of the public would be. And so even providing people with a basic understanding of cause and effect, so that's what we talked about, those sort of how possibly explanations. Somebody else could give them a how possibly explanation that's not actually true, but feels intuitively true. And then they accept that because to them, it makes sense. You've justified it with a cause and effect explanation. And that's where a lot of the flat earther, many of the people who actually all of them, I'll say that we talked to, we interviewed 30 people in the first conference and about 30 in the second conference, view themselves as critical consumers of information. They view themselves as critical thinkers. They do their own research. They watch all these videos. And one of the people who, we talked to said that he started watching the flat earth videos because he set out to debunk them. But they provided this like how possibly explanation. And some of them sound very sciencey about, the degree of the angle at which light refracts. You give people these that make sense when you don't necessarily understand all of those little like middle pieces, right? You get this logic path, and the logic path seems to make sense. And so you say, well, this has to be true. And so I think that, we say that this is one reason why giving people some level of knowledge isn't necessarily helpful, because if you don't have that high expert knowledge, it becomes really difficult to explain or understand, how we know, for example, that the Earth is round, aside from saying, well, I saw the pictures that the astronauts took. And if you don't believe the astronauts, well, then it becomes a trust and testimony issue.
Right. That gets to the point of, it's almost like with theoretical physics, everything is so strange. There's no possible way to observe it. So you're only left with this vague sense that you have to trust someone who seems to know what they're talking about, which is, of course, objectionable to all of us to have to do that. One of the questions came up, which I wanted to get to, make sure we got to, on evolution. So you had talked about the belief in evolution as one of those interesting areas of research by you and others. In recent years, due to molecular biology and genomics, there's been a shifting landscape there, I think, in the scientific community about how evolution really works, and that the commentator points out Craig Venter of the Human Genome Project had ribbed Richard Dawkins about his traditional view of evolution. So even within evolutionists, you can have, spread on what is really going on. And so, and I've heard other comments like this, the role of randomness can be much larger in evolutionary processing than simple natural selection. So with all those complexities, is there any work on whether that mixed picture, prevents the public from understanding it better? I would imagine it could, but I don't know if there's any science.
Yeah, well, so here's what I would say. The public doesn't really understand evolution, right? They have like a basic understanding of sexual selection, and that's about it. So my husband's an evolutionary biologist. He could definitely talk more about this, and I know he rips on Richard Dawkins too all the time. But I think in this case, the question that we tend to ask with evolution is, do you accept it? And in some cases, it's that, that humans evolved from earlier species of mammal, not how they evolved, whether it was sexual selection or natural selection or the role of randomness. So we don't get that specific. It's sort of just based on that topic. However, I think that people who are motivated to reject the idea of evolution will definitely glom on to certain disagreements within science and point to that as using disagreement as a reason to reject the principle in the first place. And, this is sort of going to a point that you had a bit earlier, that, science is inherently, probability based, and we have to do a lot of it before we have a good understanding. And in some ways it's like whittling, right? You start with this big chunk of wood and you're like, whittling away at it until you can find out maybe what's, sort of what effects really exist. And that's exactly the opposite of the way that people think and reason about things. And they have to sort of overcome their own heuristics and biases in order to try to think that way. And, we're not really good at that unless we don't like what people are saying. When we don't like what people are saying, then we become amazing critical thinkers. We can point out all the holes in their argument. So it's tricky. So I think that talking about sort of disagreements within science goes beyond some of what we're talking about in terms of acceptance, because we talk about it at a higher level, and not, what do you think about natural selection versus sexual selection, or is, group like kin theory versus, that's much more in depth than we talk to participants about.
No doubt. And we're running out of time, but there's one more really good question I want to get to. It's from Karen Huxtable Jester, a name you might know from Austin, Dallas. Karen asks, this is really a critical issue. If you can comment on the ethical issues relevant to planning and carrying out research like this, and particularly addressing the concern that you might inadvertently plant beliefs that would seem to endorse, someone or influence them in a certain way, maybe like that flat earther who kind of was planning to debunk it and then surprisingly took it on. If you could address that maybe really quickly.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Dr. Huxtable Jester. Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Like one, when we talk to the flat earthers, we did it very much in we're not telling you what we think is right or wrong. We just want to hear your perspectives on it. And so we were trying to capture their mental models. For the surveys where we showed them clips from the flat earth videos, it's a concern, because we're showing them misinformation. And, the best that we could do in this context was at the end of the video, talk about how the video is misinformation, but, we are exposing them to something that they could very easily glom onto. So yeah, I think my concern, at least ethically, is more on the showing the videos of misinformation than on asking people about their beliefs, because I think we can do that in a way that doesn't really affect them. But no, I think it's a really good question, and it's something too that one of our graduate students is working on a study to see whether people with a higher conspiracy mentality are experiencing awe, or like sort of different dimensions of awe when they're watching conspiracy videos. And the videos that he's trying to use are all videos that have been taken off of YouTube. And so, to what extent should we be concerned about showing people these videos? And, the best that we can do is try to debunk it at the end. But again, we can't do it ahead of time without, affecting, how they perceive it, to try to understand, perceptions of misinformation. But then on the other hand, if we, when we debunk it at the end, we're playing right into the, I've gotten emails from participants that, are like 5 pages long about how I'm wrong about things like COVID. So we definitely, can, it's a really good question, and I think it's a hard one to avoid. And we never show full documentaries for a couple different reasons, but yeah, I don't really know what to do about that other than.
Yes, thank you for your insightful talk. And I think you've highlighted such a depth of information here. I think you're going to be very busy doing this in your career moving forward. And it's such a critical and timely topic that we really have to make changes. And so I look forward to more of your work. And I think you've given the audience much food for thought. So thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time to do this, and all of your time as the audience. As we wrap up, I want to mention the Brain Health Project. So this is a signature project of our center, and the power of research really lies in how we use it to make the world a better place. In keeping with that, we've launched a large-scale landmark study called the Brain Health Project, which will help people everywhere to get proactive about maintaining and improving their brain's health and performance. And if you're interested in learning more about it and possibly participating, please scan the QR code with your phone on the screen, or you can visit thebrainhealthproject.org. That's thebrainhealthproject.org. If you're interested in continuing education credits from these talks, please email ceu.utdallas.edu. That is ceu.utdallas.edu. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next month when Christopher Simmons talks about data science. Thanks, everybody.